We've got some exciting things to talk to you about this evening, to show you. The most frustrating part to me is we've only got 2 30-minute sessions. There is much more evidence, and I've been a little bit selfish. I'm featuring the things that I've been personally involved in, or at least many of them. There is much more evidence that's available, but we hope to give you an idea. But in order to appreciate the nature of and the significance of this kind of evidence, I want to begin by telling you a little bit about the controversy, the context of controversy in which this evidence is being presented and is being opposed today. Notice the statement by Dr. Herzog, who's professor of archaeology at Tel Aviv University. This is the largest university in Israel, and you would expect that professor of archaeology there would be one who is telling you about things that support the Bible, but that's not the case. As in our country, many of the universities which used to do that now are dominated by those who oppose the Bible. And so we have statements like this. He says, "This is what archaeologists have learned from their excavations in the land of Israel. The Israelites were never in Egypt, did not conquer the land in a military campaign, and did not pass it on to the 12 tribes of Israel." That's what we've learned from the study of archaeology. Now, why would a fellow who is professor of archaeology in Israel make a statement like that? We have to put this in a larger political context. And I think we can see that context if we compare it with a statement made by the late Yasser Arafat, who is former president of the Palestinian Authority. And I think you can appreciate why he would make a statement similar to this. He says the notion of a Jewish origin in Jerusalem is a religious myth used to justify occupation and colonialism. Well, he's fighting a political battle. He says there never was a temple in Jerusalem, and there's no archaeological evidence anywhere this is a myth. Many of the secular Jews don't really care that much about the religious battle, but they know there's a lot of mad Palestinians. There's a war going on, and they like to live in peace. They don't like their malls being blown up, and so you just don't say things that aggravate them. So it's not going to help those who are religiously inclined, but so what? Peace is more important. This is the context that we see this battle going on in the middle of. In spite of the effort to establish Palestinians' right to the land or the Jewish right to the land based on archaeology, we need to just back up and look at the evidence and see what the actual facts are. And that's, of course, going to be our approach. We want to see what the evidence is for the Bible, for the history of Israel, from the stones of Israel. And I want to begin with the altar of Joshua, and I believe that's exactly what it is, on Mount Ebal. In Deuteronomy 27, we find the instructions given: when you've crossed over the Jordan, you shall set up these stones about which I'm commanding you today on Mount Ebal, and you shall cover them with plaster. Build an altar to the Lord with an altar of stones on which you've not used an iron tool. And so it's a very specific type of altar. They wrote the law in the plaster. They were excellent stone cutters at this time, just phenomenal stone cutters, but no stones that were cut were to be used here. Verse 11 says, the same day Moses charged the people as follows: when you've crossed over, you'll stand on the Mount Gerizim for a blessing. Then verse 13 says you'll stand on Mount Ebal for the curse. This is a good teaching method. We're going to read you the law. Now then, here's half of the group on this mountain and half of the group on the other mountain, and you're going to recite what's going to happen if you keep this law, and then the others are going to recite what's going to happen if you don't keep this law. And here are the blessings, here are the cursings. they understood exactly what happened, and of course we see those things taking place as they obeyed or as they didn't obey. But this altar was the center of that event. This is up in Samaria, and here we can see Mount Ebal and nearby Mount Gerizim. Dr. Adam Zertal is chairman, or was chairman, of the Department of Archaeology at the University of Haifa. He was an atheist. He was taught in his education that Joshua, Moses, David, Solomon were all fictitious creatures like Zeus, and you don't believe this foolishness. But he's an archaeologist, and he begins to look at what you can find from archaeology, and he took the area of Manasseh, and over a period of about 20 years was doing a survey, meter by meter, of that area to see what could be found. And he found an altar. Well, nobody was ready to admit this was an altar on Mount Gerizim. They'd looked on top, and it wasn't there. And so they assumed the altar that you read about in Deuteronomy wasn't there. Of course, the high places were reserved for the idols. You study the Old Testament. Literally, it says this altar was in the mountain. It's about 2/3 of the way up. And when he came across this doing his survey, he reported it in the journals. Could this be Joshua's altar? And there was just a guffaw, just ridicule. Lawrence Staggers, professor of archaeology of Israel at Harvard University, says, if a sacrificial altar stood on Mount Ebal, its impact on our research is revolutionary. All of us have to go back to kindergarten. Because they're teaching that none of this happened. There's no Exodus, there's no Moses, and no Joshua. But here's the altar, just as it's described in Deuteronomy. Well, it's not really an altar. It's a farmhouse, or it's a watchtower. Okay, but it's not on top of the mountain, and it's short and squatty. Not a very good watchtower. Doesn't have any windows and any doors. Not make a very good farmhouse. What is it? Well, they began to look, and we'll let Adam Zertal, in his own words, tell you the implications of this.
If there was an altar on Mount Ebal, the most ancient and the first Jewish or Israelite altar here, the meaning is that all the story of Deuteronomy and parts of the story in Joshua are scientifically true.
This is, I think, absolutely so, and even the enemies understood it, and so they opposed it. Here we see the altar looking across to Mount Gerizim, where the blessings were read. And one of the things that struck me when I was there, how do you get a group over here and a group that far away, and you hear each other? We sent Dr. Willie Dye across to the other side. He has, by the way, 6 earned doctorates, archaeology from Berkeley. He went across, and we yelled as loud as we could yell, Dr. Dye, can you hear us? He said, yeah, I can hear you. The acoustics were just, well, you can't believe it till you're there. It's just astounding. It was apparently just designed to accomplish exactly what was done. As he continued to excavate and look at this area, we find a large complex here where a large group of people were obviously camped. It's been restored to look like this, and obviously this short, squatty building with the ramp going up, no steps, is exactly what we see described in Deuteronomy. Probably looked like this with it's being covered by plaster. And we're reminded there in verse 25 of Exodus 20 that it was not to be made of cut stones. You'll not go up by steps. This is in contrast to all of the Canaanite altars that you might find in the area. But exactly what you find. Well, what do you find in the center? Well, they began to dig down into the center of the area, and they found it was full of ashes. Isn't that a surprise? Some of the vessels there had ashes in them, and they allowed these ashes to be examined at the Department of Zoology at the University of Haifa. They found 942 bones indicating some 50 to 100 individuals. And what kind of animals were these? If this was a Canaanite altar, they'd be sacrificing eagles and snakes and various animals. But not so with the Israelites. What they found were sheep and goats and cattle, all kosher animals, if you please. And of the ones that they could determine the sex and the age, all of them were one-year-old males. Wow. This is not a Canaanite altar. It's not a farmhouse. It's not a watchtower. Pottery was also found, and both culturally and with thermoluminescent dating, which is most appropriate for pottery. It was dated to the time of the Exodus, approximately the 13th century. In addition, he found Egyptian scarabs that came from Egypt. This is used often to date Egyptian artifacts. This is from Ramses II, which is probably the one who was reigning at the time of the Exodus, though it's not precise. But generally the time of the Exodus. All of this fits and makes a picture that's just very impressive. It was an honor to be a part of the excavation there. But let's notice the statement by Adam Zertal, who was convinced as a result of this and other evidence that he uncovered that the Old Testament was God's Word. And not only that, that the Messiah that the Old Testament predicted was the Christ. And he is a believer in Christ and has established a church up there in Samaria, independent of any denominational organization. They're teaching what appears to be New Testament Christianity to me, baptism for the remission of sins, and about a group of 40 up there in the middle of Palestinian territory. He published this material over a series of years, a number of articles as each was discovered, and then made this comment: what has happened regarding the new accumulation of facts I have cited? Almost nothing. Since the appearance of the detailed report and the many articles I have published on the excavation, silence has descended on the scholarly world. They have nothing to say. Well, I do. I think Professor Staggart needs to go back to kindergarten. That's what he said, and I agree with him. We find that Adam has continued to work and decided that he would look in the area that the Bible indicated would be Gilgal. This is where they first camped when they came across the Jordan. No one had really investigated here because most of the archaeologists had no confidence that this was a true story anyway, and they hadn't looked. And so he went to look. In Joshua chapter 4, the people came up from the Jordan on the 10th of the first month, camped at Gilgal on the eastern edge of Jericho. Well, that's pretty specific. Now, here's where it is. Those 12 stones which had taken from the Jordan, Joshua set up at Gilgal. Well, he found the spot and found more than he anticipated finding. Just was amazed. Here is the diagram that he has from his research. It's in the shape of a shoe. Now, at the heel, you find a configuration that fits precisely the dimensions of the tabernacle, which is what they set up here when they came across. Out on the toe, you find a circular area there that we'll look at again in a moment. But what is this about? And as he thought about it, he reflected back on Deuteronomy chapter 11, where Moses told them, every place on which the sole of your foot treads shall be yours. Your border will be from the wilderness to Lebanon, from the river to the Euphrates, as far as the western sea. And then Joshua said in chapter 1, every place on which the sole of your foot treads, I have given it to you, just as I've spoken to Moses. The people got there, and they set up this area to make the claim, this is ours. And they set up this double pathway of stones, the pathway in between the two rows of stones, in the shape of a foot. And evidently they marched around, perhaps with the Ark of the Covenant, saying, basically, this is ours. And that heel portion that you can see again is exactly the dimensions of the tabernacle. And that circular area down near the toe has just been, that hasn't been published yet. You won't be able to read this possibly until next year. But in the middle of that circular altar appearing is 12 standing stones. I think that's awesome. I know where those stones came from, I believe. But here is a picture of that double pathway that surrounds and defines this foot, where they were making, I believe, the claim. This country is ours. As you look at this off in the distance, you see Jericho. It's on the eastern edge, just exactly where the Bible indicated it should be. As we go to Jericho, of course, a very famous area and where a great deal of archaeological work has been done, we recall Joshua chapter 6, verse 3, you'll march around the city, all the men of war. You'll do so for 6 days. The priests carry the ram's horns. They blow the ram's horns, the trumpets, the walls fall down on the 7th day so that the people will go up straight ahead. Pretty amazing story. Not exactly a reasonable sounding battle plan. Just march them to death. Go around and around and it falls down. Well, this is not a normal plan. This is a supernatural plan. And a lot of archaeologists have been here. The original archaeologist, Garstang, did work in the early 1900s, was confident this was Joshua's Jericho. But then that was refuted, we're told. There is a cable car that allows you to go up over the tell, which you see here in the circle. This is the mound where the ancient city is found, and quite a bit of excavation can be seen from the air. Not too many people riding the cable car nowadays. This is the Hamas headquarters. They haven't quite got the knack of promoting tourism there, shooting everybody. But after Garstang had done his work, Kathleen Kenyon took over. She's one of the ones who we're told has modernized archaeology in Israel. And she says the city belonged to a much earlier time and could not be biblical Jericho based on the absence of the imported Cypriot ware pottery. This is special pottery from Cyprus. That should be there if this is Joshua's time. And there's some fairly reasonable conclusions regarding that. She dug and she didn't find it. And so she concluded it couldn't be Joshua's Jericho. She did acknowledge that things were burnt and the walls had fallen. The lack of pottery proved that it could not be Joshua's Jericho. And then she died. Fortunately. We'll have more to say about her later. Bryant Wood began to work there in the late 90s and after the turn of the century and found exactly what she said would indicate that it was Joshua's Jericho, but she says it wasn't there. He found that it was. This is expensive pottery. She was digging in the poor part of the city. He said you ought to look in the prosperous part, and he found lots of it. And we, by the way, do have an excellent example of that Cypriot pottery back in the museum, the artifact room, that you can examine. But not only did he find the pottery that she said would indicate Joshua's Jericho, he found a continuous series of Egyptian scarabs with dated inscriptions. I mean, how do you nail it down any better? An unbroken series extended from the 18th century BC, way before the Exodus, up to the time of the conquest where it stops. An unbroken series right up to the time of the conquest, and it's over. There's no way to establish it any better than that. He found a number of things, some of which Kenyon had found, the remains of a fortified tower, storage containers that had indicated were full of grain at the time that it was burned. Normally, you wouldn't find that with a conquered city because grain is a commodity much like our money today. And so the people that conquer it take the grain. But they didn't here. Well, we know they were commanded not to take things from Jericho. And furthermore, in Joshua chapter 3, we're told that when they came across the Jordan, this was at the time of the harvest. And so the storage containers would be full, and they would leave them full, and then the burned city is piled on top of it. Again, confirming what we find. He found the retrievement wall at the base of the tell that had reinforced it. He found the fallen brick outside that retrievement wall. that formed basically a ramp going up toward the city. Here are some of those fallen brick where we were just a few months ago. This is the diagram that Bryant Wood made showing the fallen brick making virtually a ramp going up the retaining wall toward the tell, and this is the way they conquered the city. One of the most amazing things that he found, just made chills go up and down my spine as I looked at it. There was one portion of the wall that was still remaining. The whole wall didn't fall. There was one, you remember there was a promise that was made to one whose house was on the wall that it would be preserved. And we look at that one portion that is left, and we see the house. I think I know who lived there. Joshua chapter 2, she let them down by a rope through the window, for her house was on the city wall, so that she was living on the wall. And she was promised that her house would be preserved. The only portion that's left. Well, I find that thrilling. We move from there to consider the story of the prophet Balaam. This has been one of the favorite objects of ridicule of the atheist. After all, he's got a talking donkey. Who in the world can believe that? And of course, that story is preserved for us in Numbers. He was working with the Moabites, the Ammonites, the enemies of the children of Israel, as at the time of the Exodus they were marching toward the Promised Land and were mowing down the people one after another, and we see what they did to this group and to that group, and the Moabites were afraid they would be conquered, and so they hired him a prophet to curse the children of Israel, Balaam. At Tel Der Allah, and the tell is a term for the mounds on which the cities were built. Usually they had been destroyed several times, and the mound was the accumulation of the destruction. They'd build the next city on top of it, and we find that all over Israel and in the area. But here is the Tel Der Allah. This is on the other side of the Jordan, as the Jabbok River meets the Jordan. And that was excavated just a few years ago. And in this Tel, they found what was actually an administration building for the Amorites. This is not the Israelites. This is the enemies of the Israelites. And it was covered with plaster that had fallen off. But on that plaster, they had written various stories. And down at the base of the wall, you see the broken plaster that they then could put together, written on with black and red ink. And so, like a jigsaw puzzle, they put this back together to see what the Amorites had to say. And there were a number of administrative details that they had, but as they put that together, they found, of all things, the story of Balaam the prophet. Again, not written by the Israelites, but by the enemies. And here is one line which says, warnings given by Balaam, the son of Behor, a seer of the gods. Now, this is from the 8th century B.C., a story of Balaam the prophet by the enemies of God. Numbers 22 says, so he sent messengers to Balaam, the son of Behor, at Prethor, which is near the river. They saw what Israel had done to the Amorites, and here's what the Amorites had to say about it. And, of course, we continue reading the latter part of the verse. Behold, the people came out of Egypt. This relates directly to the Exodus, which the archaeologists deny today. And, of course, relates to what we read in verse 28, the Lord opened the mouth of the donkey. A crazy story? Well, we have archaeological confirmation of that story and of that prophet from the enemies of the children of Israel. I think that's awesome. This material is now on display in Amman, Jordan, and you can go there and look at it in the museum. Shiloh is the way it's referred to by most of the Israelis. Joshua chapter 18, verse 1 says, the whole congregation of the sons of Israel assembled themselves at Shiloh and set up the tent of the meeting there. This was the first permanent place for the Ark of the Covenant. during the period of the Judges, and it stayed there for several hundred years. As you read further, you see pretty specific instructions about where this was, and so you can get, obviously, very close. And we found a church in the area that was built about 400 years after the time of Christ, the Byzantine period, to commemorate Shiloh, the place where they had parked the tabernacle, if you please. And the floor, a beautiful mosaic floor, happened to match the dimensions of the tabernacle, and so it was thought that this was the spot that had been chosen 400 years after Christ, long after, of course, the actual event, that was on the spot where the tabernacle was. Well, that's not really the case. Just recently, with further excavation on the tell, the northern part of that tell, they found that this was just to, yes, commemorate the spot, but not built on the spot. This is the gate that they found, and that opens the way to the path that leads up to the plateau where the tabernacle actually was. And it's so well confirmed that even the Department of Antiquities there in Israel has put up the plaque saying this, in all probability, is where the tabernacle stood. Up on that plateau that's been newly excavated, we have this stone wall, which was the base. Now, you can't really get the dimensions in this picture. We'll get more in just a moment. But the thing that really nailed this down was they found 4th century BC inscriptions. This is 800 years earlier than this Byzantine church, that clearly identified this as Shiloh. Now, it didn't really say, "Welcome to Shiloh," but it was pretty close. 400 years before the time of Christ. And as we look at the outline here in stone, we see where the tent poles were, the holes in regular intervals that go right on around and were to support the tent, the tabernacle. Looking at this picture, you'd really need to be 50 feet in the air, which was kind of hard for me to do. But with the line here, you can see the dimensions of the tabernacle, which fit beautifully. This is where the tabernacle was for well over 300 years, and where they worshiped during the period of the Judges. This was the capital of Israel during that period, if you please. This is where the sacrifices and the annual feast took place, where the land was allotted to the tribes, where Eli judged, and Hannah prayed, and Samuel served, and where Eli fell and died. Actually, it wasn't here at this spot. The text says that when he heard the story of the capture of the ark and of the loss of the battle and the death of his sons, he was at the gate. Well, we found the gate, you recall, that leads to this place. This is where he would have been sitting and where he fell and died. From all of the evidence, it's convincing even the skeptics. One after another, we're finding the inscriptions were found in the last 6 months, so it's just almost every month we're finding new confirmation. The fortified gates of Solomon have been known for half a dozen years, but they're interesting confirmation of what we read in 1 Kings chapter 9. This is the account of the forced labor which King Solomon levied to build the house of the Lord, his own house, the Milo. This is at Jerusalem. And then also he built at Hazor and Megiddo and Gezer. Well, of course, Solomon is this fictitious creature like Zeus that the real scholars don't believe in. But what did he do at Hazor and Megiddo and Gezer? Well, you go there and you find these strange-looking gates that guard the city. Very difficult to break through these gates into the city with this kind of fortification. And the places where you find these gates are at Hazor and Megiddo and Gezer. And the pottery that we find associated with the gates is from the time of Solomon. Isn't that a surprise? I think that's exactly what the text describes. That's where Solomon built. One of the most exciting bits of evidence was found a number of years ago, but brand new evidence has been uncovered within the last 2 years. It involved 2 silver amulets from the 7th century B.C. They were found in Jerusalem at the place now occupied by St. Andrew's Scottish Presbyterian Church, just south of Old Jerusalem. The first find was made in 1979. Gordon Frantz was the supervisor of this dig, actually under the guidance of the director of Gordon Barkay, who wasn't there when the actual find took place. Judith Hadley is the one who actually found the silver amulet. She was a grad student at Wheaton, and she's now professor at Villanova. But one of her colleagues is laying here in what was a tomb. It's a collapsed tomb. It was over him at the time this was originally built. And under where he's laying is a storage area with a number of pots, pottery, various artifacts. And it was in the corner, as Barclay is indicating in the inset there, that this amazing find was made. Silver amulets that were rolled up, but they had inscriptions on them from the Bible. This is from Numbers chapter 6, verse 24. The Lord bless you and keep you, and the Lord make his face to shine upon you. The priestly blessing was what the priest wore around their neck. They inscribed this on the pieces of silver, rolled it up, and wore it as an amulet. This is from Jeremiah's time, clearly identified from the pottery, as well as from other cultural implications, and really not even contested by the liberals. Well, how did they inscribe so well on silver? In fact, we found with infrared technology in the last 2 years much more than what they originally found. Numbers 6, 24, 25, and 26 were very obvious. As we developed more technology, reported in the New York Times, by the way, just 2 years ago, almost the whole chapter of the context is engraved on the back of it. How did they do that? I think we get a hint from Jeremiah 17, where we read, the sin of Judah is written down with an iron stylus with a diamond point. It is engraved on the tablet of their heart. Evidently, they were doing some engraving with diamonds at the end of an iron stylus. And so on this, you do have the text. Now, the significance we related to this morning when we were talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, the documentary hypothesis says these books that comprise the earliest books supposedly written by Moses, the early writers, weren't written then at all, but written after the captivity. And this is what the documentary hypothesis is supposed to have proved. And we found then some of the Dead Sea Scrolls that were actual copies of the Paleo-Hebrew, which had to have been written prior to the exile, because that's the only time that style was used. Now, when they found the 300 BC copies, it wasn't from before the exile, but there were copies of what was before the exile. This was not a copy. This was written before the exile. This was 400 years older than the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it is precisely like the text that we have today. Identical. 2 renditions of it and almost a whole chapter on the back side. 400 years older than the Dead Sea Scrolls. That just says the people that have given their faith to the documentary hypothesis have made fools out of themselves as they tried to deny the Word of God. We move to Tel Dan. This is up at the northern end of Israel. We can see Mount Hermon in the background. This is the northern extremity of Israel, and there we find Dan. You remember when the kingdom split, and you got Jeroboam and Rehoboam. Rehoboam took the 10 tribes to the north, and he set up at Dan and at Bethel altars to keep them from going back to Jerusalem. Well, even the Department of Antiquities now have recognized that they have found that altar at Dan, and they have their signs put up that commemorates Jeroboam's altar at Tel Dan. This is a picture of that restored. The metal part has been restored, but they have found with the utensils clear indications that that's what that is. This is Dr. Clifford Wilson, who was head of excavations at Gazer for a number of years, a very strong believer in the Word of God. The utensils that they found that were used by the priests to offer the sacrifices are now in the museum there in Jerusalem. This was one of two altars, you remember, at Dan and at Bethel. Well, the altar at Bethel was destroyed, wasn't it, by the curse. Remember the young prophet and the old prophet in that story, and he cursed the altar and it split. This one didn't, and this one we have found. On the southern side of the city of Dan, that has been excavated over a number of years, we see the gate to the city. In a number of places in the Old Testament, you read that they sat at the gates, and this is where judgment was rendered. You remember Job sat at the gates of the city, and others had judgment rendered there. This is a scene that gives insight into that. Here's where the judge sat, the elders sat beside him. Now these wooden poles, of course, have been restored, but they fit into the sockets that were there, and they were for the wooden poles, and look just like this. Just outside that gate, another excavation took place in 1993. Here's where the gate was that we just looked at. Just outside, an inscription that formed a stele. This is an upright stone with writing on it commemorating some historical event, typically. Was found in 1993 by an official Providence dig. One of the objections the archaeological people make if you find something that they don't like, well, it's not a Providence dig. It wasn't under the authority of the Department of Antiquities. And most of the great finds, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, weren't found in that manner. But this was by one of the leading archaeologists in Israel, a Providence dig under the auspices of the Department of Antiquities, and it describes a battle between Hazael, king of Aram, and the kings of Judah and Israel. Again, this was written by the enemies, by the one who actually defeated Israel, and basically it's saying, I just whooped them bad. I destroyed the house of David. Now, one of the statements that you find commonly in the standard textbooks is there's no reference to David, there's no archaeological evidence for this great kingdom, and we'll see some of that in a minute. And it's not so. And here is absolute proof that there was a house of David, that this claim that they never existed is just dishonest, because it has been archaeologically confirmed, again, by the enemies of God.